Okay, thanks very much. If folks need to get up to grab a little more of a snack or to use the restroom or something, just please be discreet and walk out the back once the presentation has started. These doors here immediately to your left can be pretty noisy as the fire doors open and shut. So welcome to today's event. My name is Brian Traynor. I'm a professor here in the Department of Philosophy as well as the director of the Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination. We're co-sponsoring this event, but the event is really the event of the Taylor Chair. My colleague, Dr. Wong, will be making an announcement in a second. I just want to announce, before we begin, a second talk that we're having this Friday. 2 in 1 week is a lot, but we're taking advantage of 2 extraordinary speakers who happen to be passing through Los Angeles. So the talk this Friday is on the human difference. It's a talk on philosophy and environmental philosophy, and if you're able to make that, it would be great as well. I'll put the flyer for it on the back table for those folks who might be interested. Could I also ask you all to go ahead and silence your cell phones? That generally works best by turning them off, not to vibrate. We can all hear when they vibrate these days as well, and that won't interrupt the event. So it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Robin Wong, who's an extraordinary philosopher in her own right, and also currently the Taylor Chair of Philosophy here in the Department of Philosophy. She'll be running a program for the next 2 academic years, this year and the following academic year, about which I believe she has some words to enlighten you. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you. So in 2009 LMU's address, Father Adolfo Nicholas, and then the Supreme General of the Jesuits, discussed the need to find ways to sharing Ignatian's spiritual exercise with non-Christians. He stated that the exercise can be, quote, fruitfully appropriated even by non-Christians. I would like to underline this idea that a spiritual exercise can be shared by non-Christians. Even though Christ is at the heart of the full exercise full experience of exercise, it is also true that their structure involves process of liberation, of opening to new horizons, that can benefit people who do not share our life of faith. This is something I would like to see explored more and more. What are the dynamics in the exercise that non-believers might make their own to find wider horizons in life, a greater sense of spiritual freedom? End of quote. To follow up with Father Nicholas' vision, we may ask how Ignatian spirituality can be fruitfully appropriated by members of other traditions, such as Taoism. In her newly published book, A World on Fire, Sharing Ignatian Spiritual Exercise with Other Religions, Aaron Klein, by the way, who will be come in the spring to LMU, give us a talk, proposed 2 different directions. One might go on this. First, one might adopt exercise for members of other traditions who are interested in encounter Christ through the exercise. Second, one might explore how Ignatian ways of praying could be helpful to members of other traditions for deepening their own spiritual lives if they are used in a different way. This term of Robert Taylor Chair in Philosophy will explore both directions, yet it will pay more attention to how Ignatian spirituality could be used to enrich Taoist spirituality. The mindfulness, contemplation, self-reflection, and imagination are all at the heart of both Taoist and Ignatian spiritual practices. This Tao and the Ignition Spirituality Project, we also discuss and form a much deeper philosophical question about the belief and practice. Taoism and the Ignition tradition each have such rich spiritual practice, but different beliefs about what one is doing when engaged in them. What are the real differences between the beliefs and the practice between Ignition and the Taoist tradition? Indeed, there appear to be many questions worth exploring at the intersection of these approaches. Today, we have our first Taylor Chair speaker, Father Thomas Sherman. Father Sherman is a truly international scholar and a global citizen. I want to see this because he got his BA at Maquette University, his PhD at the University of Toronto. He's especially interested in philosophy of religion, comparative ancient Greek, and Chinese moral philosophy. There's a very interesting experience he has. He was a professor of philosophy at the Sejong University in Seoul, Korea, from 1987 1990, 4 years. He also be assistant professor at LMU, 2000-2007. He received a tenure. Now, over that corner is his office. So he's been LMU 7 years, but he left. Where did he go? A professor of philosophy, become a professor of philosophy at the Rupe College in Zimbabwe for 8 years. Not yet. Now he's a philosophy professor at the Gaglia University in Rome, Italy. So, he has lived, worked all continent of the world, right? So today, our father will put Father Nicholas' vision of sharing Ignatian spirituality with another tradition into practice. Please join me to welcome Father Sherman.
Well, Robin, thank you for that very kind, generous, charitable description of my career. I look at myself more like, in baseball terms, not a heavy hitter, but a utility infielder. I get traded a lot, so I've been working in many different institutions, enjoyed them all, and so I'm very, very happy to be here. I have a special place in my heart for Loyola Marymount University, and so it's just a privilege to come back here. You know, we as a faculty here in the philosophy department, we used to gather together for colloquia. We used to come together and we used to share the things we were working on. And we used to share that with the members of our department, and then we would get feedback, and I found it always very helpful. So in a way, I'm coming back to give a colloquium. And so I'm anxious, I'm very happy to see some of my confreres here, as well as the students, and I look forward to your comments and questions. So, let us begin. I like to begin all my lectures, and in particular this lecture, with a moment of silence. So I'm going to ask all of us to take maybe a minute of silence. You can pray, you can meditate, but I'm going to ask you simply silently to be present. One of the verses of the Tao Te Ching has it that being comes out of silence. And so our lecture and our discussion appropriately can come out of silence. So my presentation, my PowerPoint presentation, is really an attempt to compare an aspect of St. Ignatius's spiritual exercises, that is, the rules for the discernment of spirits, with the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu. And I'm going to do it in such a way that I'm going to interpret the Tao Te Ching according to the approach I'm going to take with Ignatius. And let me explain that approach just as overall. The title of this presentation is, How Can I Live My Life Well and Know That I Am Doing So? Those of you familiar with Aristotle remember what he says about happiness. To be happy, it's not enough to do what is right. It's not enough to act virtuously. But I have to know that I'm acting virtuously. And I should enjoy it. If I don't know that I'm a virtuous person acting virtuously, and if I don't enjoy it, I'm not living a happy life. I might be a good person, I might be living virtuously, but I'm not happy. So there's an aspect of human fulfillment, human happiness, living well, that is objective and subjective. There's an object dimension in living well that we can discuss, and we'll look at the objective dimension of living well in St. Ignatius's spiritual exercises and the Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. But there's also, every bit as important, a subjective dimension, my own experience. What is my experience? How am I feeling when I'm living well? This will be critical. So both are important. Living well, but also enjoying my life. Feeling at peace, at one, as we'll look at some of the descriptions of this. So keep these in mind. So we're going to look at St. Ignatius, his rules for the discernment of spirits, and we're going to look at Lao Tzu from this perspective of the objective, what does it mean to live well, and from the subjective, how should that feel, living well. Okay? Now, so what we're going to do here, we're going to look at two works. So the rules for discernment of spirits is an aspect, one part of Ignatius's spiritual exercises. And the project of the spiritual exercises for St. Ignatius is this. You take a retreat, you move away from your day-to-day life. And what do? You try to meet Jesus Christ. How? Through meditation, through prayer. You take the Bible, all right? You take especially the Gospels. And for a period of time, the full exercises is 30 days. For the full period of the exercises, it's divided into 4 weeks. But all 4 weeks look at some aspect of who Jesus Christ is. All right? Now, obviously, to approach the spiritual exercises in this way, you have to already be converted in the sense that not necessarily that I'm a Christian. So I've had non-Christians come to me to ask to do the spiritual exercises. But you have to be converted enough to I want to get to know who this Jesus is. All right, so it's very, very practical. It's not simply theoretical. Like at a university, we often do a lot of studies, don't we? And the interest is theoretical. What is this about? All right, for the spiritual exercises, and I'm going to argue for the Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, the purpose is not simply theoretical. It's especially practical. How do I live this? How do I put this into practice? I am so interested, for instance, I'm so attracted to Jesus Christ. I want not just to know about him, but I want to know him in activity, in my life. All right? Now, for Ignatius, union with God, doing God's will, involves being with Jesus Christ. How? In my choices in my life. It could be a choice of a way of life. What am I going to be? What kind of person will I be? But it's more concrete than that. It would be, for instance, should I become a priest? Should I become a married person? What kind of job ought I to take? But it also can involve not just simply a life choice, but it can involve certain actions that are very, very important for me. Right? So, for instance, I'm going to suggest that we're going to stay with this example. As students, some of you maybe are freshmen, and how many of you have decided what your major is? Okay, how many have not? Okay, some of us, okay? Now, I'm going to propose this as one example of making a choice, an important choice, maybe not a life choice, but it could be significant, all right? What you choose as a major could radically affect how you live in the future, what kind of life you'll live. All right, so this would be an aspect, so a practical question you have. I'm not sure what major I should take, okay? Now that would be a question. Now, for someone already converted, so to speak, to Jesus Christ, you wouldn't ask the typical question, well, let me figure out my future, let me figure out how this is going to work in my plan of life. You're going to first say, how does God view my decision? What is my relationship with God? Can I allow God to help me make a decision? Can I make a decision in line with God's will? Now notice, not every person thinks that way, right? But if you do, if you're interested in making an important choice, but coming out of your relationship with God, in particular in Jesus Christ for St. Ignatius, then you might be very interested in making the spiritual exercises as a way of listening, looking at Jesus, looking at his life, all right, and then being open to the Spirit of Jesus within me. And this is where it gets to experience, the objective, the subjective. The objective is contemplation of Jesus in the Gospels, his different adventures in his life, his suffering, death, and resurrection. That would be the objective dimension. The subjective dimension is, how is the Spirit of Jesus affecting me in my life? How am I feeling? And to look at how I'm feeling, my inner experience, for Ignatius, this is an important way, one way, but an important way, of coming to understand what God might want from me or for me. Okay? So this is the importance of this. Now, when we look at the Tao Te Ching, we see a parallel, an analogous invitation. We look at the Tao, and we'll be looking at some verses of the Tao Te Ching, all right? The Tao is understood by Lao Tzu as the fundamental reality, the fundamental reality. And Lao Tzu he presents us with the sage, and the sage is one, the wise man, who wants to live according to the Tao. Objectively, as he contemplates the Tao in nature, he wants to live this way. I want to live like the Tao. All right? Now, in doing so, the sage is going to have some special experiences. And we're going to look at those experiences because in some way they're going to be interestingly similar to the experiences Ignatius is going to talk about. Okay? But through these experiences, the sage comes to know that he is really following the Tao. Okay, so there's this subjective, this objective. But, as we'll see, it can get a bit complicated. And this is why we need guidance. We need guidance from people like St. Ignatius. We need guidance from people like Lao Tzu, who have gone through this and can help us in our understanding of what it means to live well and know that I am doing so. So, we're going to begin with Ignatius. Okay, so here I am. I'm a student here at LMU. I want to make a decision. I want to decide what is the proper major for me. Okay, now I have my own views, but I want to know, I'm interested in my relation with Jesus Christ. I want to know, how would this relate to my life with Christ? What might God want me to do? Okay, so that's what we'll be looking at. Now, to do that, again, you look at the life of Jesus, but in doing so, you bring your own life to bear. Each one of us is unique. To follow Jesus is going to be unique to each one of us. I may follow Jesus, but my life might look quite different from yours. All right, so this is one of the very, very interesting dynamics. This isn't a cookie cutter process. Each one of us, in encountering Jesus in the gospel, we bring ourselves and our decision, our desires, our hopes, our fears, our strengths, our weaknesses. We bring that to the Lord, and then we listen. Where am I being attracted? All right? Now, this is where we get into what Ignatius calls spiritual discernment. All right, so his famous rules for the discernment of spirits. All right, these rules are really guidelines that St. Ignatius compiles over his years of experience of conversion and also his experience of different discernments. He had to make important decisions in his life, and he always tried to pray about that. Where is God leading me? All right. So these rules he writes down. They're guidelines. Now, they come from his experience, but he also researched the Christian tradition, especially the Desert Fathers and Mothers, who went out into the desert for years, for the rest of their lives in some cases, and struggled with their internal experience. All right. So these rules are guidelines for us when we take the decision we want to make, and we look at that, and we say, now, where might God be leading me? All right, let me just give a few more introductory remarks, and then we'll look at some of these rules. So rules are guidelines. Now, spirits. Rules for the discernment of spirits. It's important Ignatius makes a distinction, and he generally follows this distinction, between soul and spirit. For Ignatius, soul would be close to the biblical notion of heart. It's the heart, it's the center of who I am. Okay? Everything flows from my soul, even my body, how I appear to you, how I act, is really a manifestation of what is within my soul. And the soul, each one of us has a soul, we're human beings, but each one of us is unique. So the movements, the attractions or repulsions we feel in our lives are going to be unique to us. Certainly there's going to be a commonality. We're all human. We're attracted to food when we're hungry, right? We're attracted to drink when we're thirsty. But each one of us has a set of preferences, desires, what we enjoy doing, what we do not enjoy doing. This is part of who each and every one of us is. These are movements of soul, all right? So when I'm attracted to something, all right, I feel joy. I feel love for what I'm attracted for. This is a movement. It moves me. It impels me to make a choice for what I love. But I can also have a negative movement of soul, those things that repel me for whatever reason. And it can go deep down to our psyches, it can go to our family histories, or etc. But this is where I am repelled. So there's a movement of soul, but it's against what I encounter. Okay, so these movements of soul, Ignatius says, is very important. We first need to get in touch with our histories. So self-knowledge. What attracts me? What is my character like? Okay, very, very important. Now, that's movement of soul, so self-knowledge. But spirit, for Ignatius, is not the soul. Spirit, for Ignatius, is not me. Spirit is some outside force. But it's a personal force. It's not an impersonal force. It's some influence upon my soul. This is who I am, my soul, which includes the body. All right? But it's an influence on me, but it comes from outside of me. And it can influence me on how I think and how I feel. And it can even influence me on how I act. Although ultimately I am free, nevertheless, I can be influenced by outside influences, spirits. Now, these spirits for Ignatius are personal, and he divides them in two. There are the good spirit and the bad spirit. God is one of the good spirits, and ultimately God is the ultimate principle of goodness. But there are also what Ignatius calls evil spirits. Now, how does he distinguish these two? Good and evil spirits. It's always, ultimately, his objective criterion is the life of Jesus Christ. And that's what we're contemplating. Remember, I'm contemplating who Jesus is because I want to make a choice of a way of life, okay? Now, the good spirit, God and or the angels, for Ignatius, will influence my soul in such a way that I will be attracted to Jesus. I will grow closer to Jesus. Whereas the evil spirit is the reverse. The evil spirit will try to influence me to turn away from Jesus. Okay? But now notice the criterion, and we'll look at this carefully once we begin with the rules. The criterion is not necessarily the feeling itself, but where the feeling is moving me. Does it move me closer to Jesus, as I read in the Gospels, understood in the faith community, or does it move me away? Right? So it's very personal, and that's why for Ignatius, these spirits are personal. Okay? Now, finally, we looked at rules, we looked at spirit versus soul. The final thing is discernment. What is discernment? Discernment is a process by which I try to understand a reality that is complex, that is complicated, that is multifaceted. And to understand that multifaceted reality, I have to make distinctions. I have to analyze. What is synthesized, what apparently is synthesized, I need to analyze. What are the components of this experience? Right? So, when we talk about discernment of spirits, for Ignatius, each one of us is complicated. We have our own soul. Each one of us has movements of soul. We have our own character, likes and dislikes. That's who we are. But each one of us is also influenced by spirits, good or evil. It's complicated. So what is discernment? Discernment is this process where I try, with God's help for Ignatius and with the spiritual director, I try to analyze where are my thoughts and feelings coming from? Are they coming from simply me? Is it simply characteristic of me? For instance, I like to study. I've always liked to study. I've loved to read. This is a natural characteristic for me. All right? Some of you don't like to study or would rather do something else. So again, this is something natural to each one of us. So you have to get in touch with that, but then there are also experiences that I can have, and you have too, if you're attentive enough, that aren't coming from you, that are coming from outside of you. And yet they're very intimate to you, all right? So this is the action of spirit. So discernment is this process whereby I try to distinguish what is complicated. I'll give you an example. Let's look at a ball of yarn. All right, a ball of yarn, say if I presented this ball of yarn to you, it looks orange. But as you look at it carefully, there are 3 different strands. At the heart, there's a core, maybe it's gray. And then there's strands that are orange or yellow, and other strands that are red. All together, the ball appears orange. But as you look at it closely, it's a confluence of red, yellow, and gray. Now that's a metaphor that might help us. When we discernment of spirits, remember, in my desire to make a good choice, according to God's will, I have to distinguish what is of me, naturally, what is coming from the good spirit, maybe the yellow, and what is coming from the evil spirit, the red, all right? So this is this process. This is what Ignatius calls discernment of spirits. Is it easy? No. It takes self-knowledge. It takes maturity. Ignatius didn't think children could make the spiritual exercises. He didn't think immature people could make them. He felt only people who are mature, who have enough experience that they understand themselves so that they're able to distinguish what is not of me and where it comes from. Okay? So that is our little introduction. And so let us look at some of these rules. Some first week rules for the discernment of spirits. Ignatius looks at these rules, by the way, are not exhaustive, but he divides them. Again, they're guides. They're guides for us and for our spiritual director, someone who's helping us in our retreat, to be able to, again, to discern what is happening within, which is complicated, okay? Now, Ignatius divides these rules into first week and second week. The first week, and we're going to just look at a few of them, is pretty straightforward, all right? The second week is when I'm led into experiences that are much more complicated, all right? So, but let's look at the first week, some of the first week rules. And what I want to do here is I want to skip the 2 basic rules for all discernment for Ignatius are found in the first week. The third rule, the so-called third rule, and the fourth rule. So let's look at, I'm going to skip, for time, I'm going to skip, I'm going to move right to the third rule. In some way, this is the most important rule in all discernment of spirits for Ignatius. And it's called spiritual consolation. What is spiritual consolation? All right, now, let's read it together. Spiritual consolation. I call it consolation when an interior movement is aroused in the soul. So remember our soul, the movements of soul. So an interior movement is aroused in the soul by which it is inflamed with the love of its Creator and Lord, and as a consequence can love no creature on the face of the earth for its own sake, but only in the Creator of them all. It is likewise consolation when one sheds tears that move to the love of God, whether it be because of the sufferings of Christ our Lord, or for any other reason that is immediately directed to the praise and service of God. Finally, I call consolation every increase of faith, hope, and love and all interior joy, notice all these feeling terms, that invites and attracts what is heavenly and to the salvation of one's soul by filling it, the soul, with peace and quiet in its Creator and Lord. Okay, this is what Ignatius calls spiritual consolation. Now, consolation is a term we often use for any experience I find that is attractive, that is nice, that I like. You know, at night when I'm relaxed and I'd like to, I think of eating ice cream. All right, eating ice cream is consoling for me. Now, some of you might not like ice cream. I love, now, chocolate chip, I don't like vanilla, I find very consoling, all right? Now, this, or for instance, when somebody says something nice about me, I feel consoled. It's nice to be liked, right? These are consoling experiences. This is not what Ignatius is talking about. He's talking about these are attractive experiences, but they're always centered on God. Spiritual consolation. So the intention is always with God. So when I'm thinking about God, or when I'm doing something in relation to God, if I find that I'm consoled, this, for Ignatius, would be spiritual consolation. Really, I'm experiencing the love of God. Okay? Now, for Ignatius, this is the most important rule, because Ignatius, as we'll see, for Ignatius, if I'm really doing what God wants me to do, I ought to feel consolation, spiritual consolation. If I'm not, as we'll see, I need to ask whether I am really doing God's will. Okay, so spiritual consolation is basic. But the fourth rule, the second most important, is spiritual desolation. Spiritual desolation, I call desolation what is entirely the opposite of what is described in the third rule, as darkness of soul, turmoil of spirit, inclination to what is lowly and earthly, restlessness rising from many disturbances and temptations, which lead to want of faith, want of hope, and want of love. The soul is wholly slothful, tepid, sad, separated, as it were, from its Creator and Lord. For just as consolation is the opposite of desolation, so the thoughts that spring from consolation are opposite of those that spring from desolation. So now remember, this is spiritual desolation. So if you tend to think, well, is he talking about depression? For Ignatius, no, he's not talking about depression. Depression is desolating. It feels terrible, it's dark, it's miserable. But what Ignatius is talking about is when I feel that depression, when I'm thinking about God, or when I'm trying to do what I think is God's will, and I feel depressed, that for Ignatius would be spiritual desolation. Okay, now this is extremely important for Ignatius, all right? So this, when we talk about discernment of spirits, first and foremost, again, know who I am, my natural likes and dislikes, but also to be aware of spiritual consolation, spiritual desolation. All right, let's go on. Fifth rule. In the time of desolation, we should never make any change, but remain firm and constant in the resolution and decision which guided us the day before the desolation, or in the decision in which we adhered in the preceding consolation. For just as in consolation the good spirit guides, God or angels, and counsels us, in desolation the evil spirit guides and counsels. Following his counsels, we can never find the way to a right decision. So let's go back to my example of trying to decide what my major will be. Let's say on one side, I'm attracted to philosophy as a major. Okay? I naturally like to study, I'm very interested in some of the great thinkers. I'm interested in my faith and how my faith is related to reason and science. When I go onto YouTube and I listen to people like Sam Harris and the New Atheists, I want to argue with them, but I need the tools. Philosophy, as I think about it, would be an excellent way, being a major in philosophy, would be an excellent way to be able to do this. Now, I bring that to God, say for instance in the retreat, philosophy. Now, as I present that to God, praying about the attractiveness of philosophy for me, if I feel consolation, remember it's about God, if I feel consolation, this is a good indication for Ignatius that this is what God wants. A good indication. We'll see it gets a little more complicated. But you see, God for Ignatius, for someone who wants to follow God, God's will, God always leads by joy, peace, consolation. Always. The evil spirit, on the other hand, wants to move me away, feel depressed when I think about God, or dark. Okay? Now, this is what Ignatius is saying. So let's say I'm thinking about philosophy and I feel consolation, spiritual consolation. Say, for instance, I'm also attracted to film and television as a major. Now, let's just say for the sake of, I'm not trying to denigrate film and television, but for the sake of my experience, I like film and television, naturally. I'm very attracted to talking in public. I love some of these documentaries I've seen. I've seen some wonderful movies that have really changed my life, and hence, I'm attracted to that as a major, okay? Now, I bring that in my retreat before the Lord, again, following the life of Jesus, but I don't feel spiritual consolation. For some reason, I feel dark. For some reason, God is not a part of this decision, and I feel it. I feel darkness. I feel that I'm moving away from God. Now, this is, of course, hypothetical, but for Ignatius, that would be a good indication right off the bat that for some reason, I'll need to explore that further, but for some reason this is not according to God's will. For me, it might be for you or for others, but again, remember this is always personal, all right? So for me at least, this is not. So let's just say then that I decide I'm going to be a philosophy major, okay? Again, it seems to be that God is attracting me to this because I'm feeling the love of God when I think of a philosophy major. Now, say for instance I go on, so I start my classes and whatnot, but as I go on, I start to feel occasionally desolation. I think, where is God? As I'm studying David Hume, I think, God, where is God in this? You know, and I'm wondering. I'm experiencing here, again, it's on a feeling level, I'm experiencing desolation, I'm experiencing sloth, I'm experiencing a lack of God. Does that mean that God doesn't want me to be studying philosophy? No. For Ignatius, never make a decision when you're in desolation. Never. Because in desolation, you're feeling apart from God, you're not open the way you could be with some other decision, all right? So what Ignatius says is, again, in time of desolation, we should never make any change, but remain firm and constant in the resolution and decision which guided us the day before the desolation, or the week or month or year before, when through my retreat, I discerned that God wanted me to be a philosopher. Or at least get a major in philosophy. Now, so don't make any change when you're in desolation. Okay? Sixth rule. Though in desolation we must never change our former resolution, my decision to have philosophy as a major, it will be very advantageous to intensify our activity against the desolation. How? We insist more on prayer, upon meditation, and on much examination of ourselves. We can make an effort in a suitable way to do some penance. So notice, I have this experience, this dark experience, not coming from me, it's sudden. Right? What do I need to do? Well, I've already made a decision through consolation, through discernment. All right, so what I need to do is rather pray, ask God for strength to get through this. Because it's not me, it's coming from something else, some other place. Help me to get through. Okay? So I have to act against the desolation. Ignatius talks about adere contra, act against. How? By prayer, maybe by fasting, by meditation, by going to someone that I trust and say, look, I'm really feeling that God isn't here. Am I making the wrong decision? See? So this is what we need to do to act against that desolation. Now, we come to some second week rules for the discernment of spirits. So, we've gotten to, let's go to the first rule, the second week. It is characteristic of God and his angels, the good spirits, when they act upon the soul, who I am, to give true happiness and spiritual joy, and to banish all the sadness and the disturbances caused by the enemy. It is characteristic of the evil one to fight against such happiness and consolation by proposing fallacious reasonings, subtleties, and continual deceptions. All right, in some way, this seems to be a reiteration of what Ignatius has talked about, except for one thing. Ignatius says in that second line, he says, in characteristic of God and his angels, when they act upon the soul to give true happiness and spiritual joy. He seems to be implying that there may be an experience of joy, even of happiness, that is not true. So we'll see, and that's indeed the case. But as we go on, second rule. Ignatius writes, God alone can give consolation to the soul without any previous cause. It belongs solely to the Creator to come into a soul, to leave it, to act upon it, to draw it wholly to the love of the divine majesty. I said without previous cause, that is, without any previous perception or knowledge of any subject by which a soul might be led to such consolation through its own acts of will and intellect. So here Ignatius brings in another experience. It's an experience of consolation, but it's different from consolation of ordinary spirits, good spirits. It comes right at the heart of who I am. It is a direct influence from God himself. All right? And for Ignatius, that experience comes only from God. Not from a good spirit, certainly not from an evil spirit. Okay? Now, what might that mean? That might mean, for instance, in my discernment, say I'm trying to decide what kind of major I'm going to take, okay? If I experience this consolation, it seems to be that Ignatius is arguing I can be sure this is God's will for me. This doesn't happen often. In fact, it's very extraordinary. It's an extraordinary experience. It would be something like the experience St. Paul describes on the road to Damascus. He has this experience of Jesus. That's it. Or when Jesus calls the disciples, he says, leave everything and follow me. He passes the tax booth where Matthew is. He says, follow me. Boom, Matthew follows him. This is This would be an experience for Ignatius of consolation without previous cause. Comes directly from God. I know this is God's will, and God is giving me this consolation, this delight in God, that I cannot be mistaken. Third rule. If a cause preceded, all right, so we're getting back to this consolation, but it's not directly from God. So if a cause preceded, both the good angel and the evil spirit can give consolation to a soul, but for quite different purposes. Now notice, this is radically new. Ignatius is saying that I could have a consolation. Remember what consolation is? Spiritual. I feel the love of God, but it may be coming from the evil spirit, not God. Okay? The good angel consoles for progress of the soul, again, to move me closer to Jesus, that it may advance and rise to what is more perfect, closer to Jesus' life. The evil spirit, notice, consoles, use this, the evil spirit consoles for purposes that are contrary, and that afterwards he might draw the soul to his own perverse intentions and wickedness. Okay? Let's give an example in Scripture. Jesus' temptations in the desert. Notice how the devil tempts him. It's always from something attractive at first, but then it leads to something dark. If you really trust, remember the evil spirit takes Jesus up to the top of the temple. He says, do you trust God? Of course you trust God, Jesus. He's your Father. But if you really trust him, and that's beautiful, if you really trust him, throw yourself down. God will protect you if you trust him. Now notice, this is a consolation if you trust God. I mean, it sounds good at first, but notice where it goes. It goes to some place dark. And of course, Jesus resists. Right? This is what can happen for us. Now, I'll give you an example. Again, I'm discerning, and I'm thinking at first, yes, I think being a philosopher is the way to go. I'm feeling consolation. Okay, so it seems like God is accepting this, that this is God. And then I begin to plan, okay, now I'll become a philosopher, and I'll be a brilliant person, and people will respect me, and I will gain influence on others, and I will become a powerful figure, and people will love me, and wow, where's that going? Is that leading me? Notice, at first I'm consoled, but where is the consolation leading me? If the consolation is leading me away from Jesus, Jesus' humility, Jesus' closeness with God, the wisdom of Jesus, if it's leading away from me, then, I need to look at that. Maybe I was mistaken. Okay? Now, Ignatius writes, it is a mark of the evil spirit to assume the appearance of an angel of light. This is in the second week. Remember, the first week, it's desolation. Right? That's fairly easy to discern. Desolation is not consolation. But here, as I get closer to Jesus, as I begin to follow him, the temptations get subtle. It is the mark of the evil spirit to assume the appearance of an angel of light. He begins by suggesting thoughts that are suited to a devout soul and ends by suggesting his own. For example, he will suggest holy and pious thoughts that are wholly in conformity with the sanctity of the soul. Afterwards, he will endeavor little by little to end by drawing the soul into his hidden snares and evil designs. In other words, little by little, from what seemed like a consolation coming from the good spirit, now it seems to me leading me away from Jesus. Pride, the desire to be loved by people and impressed because of all my publications, et cetera, et cetera. Whoa, this is not leading me closer to Jesus, but away from Jesus. So maybe this original consolation was not of the good spirit. Right? Now, St. Paul talks about this. St. Ignatius is taking from the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians, that the angel of, even an angel, rather an evil spirit can present himself as an angel of light. So you have to be very careful. Fifth rule. We must carefully observe the whole course of our thoughts. If the beginning, middle, and end of the course of thoughts are wholly good and directed to what is entirely right, it is a sign that they are from the good angel. So if I go through my discernment, all right, should I be a major in philosophy, all right, and I'm attracted, I feel close to Jesus, and as I think it through, the desire to know more, helping me to become more humble, say, to help others. Right, this is the good spirit. Okay? This seems to be God leading me to become a philosophy major. Okay? But if it leads away, no. Again, it may end in what weakens the soul or disquiets it, or by destroying the peace, tranquility, and quiet which it had before. It may cause disturbance to the soul. These things are a clear sign that the thoughts are proceeding from the evil spirit, the enemy of our progress in eternal salvation. But notice, the beginning was all sweetness and light. The love of God. Tears of weeping because of Jesus' suffering for me, etc., etc. But it ends badly. The evil spirit can mimic this type of consolation. Eighth rule. We skip to the eighth rule here. When consolation is without previous cause, as was said, so we go back to this special consolation of God, there can be no deception in it, since it can proceed from God our Lord only. But a spiritual person who has received such a consolation must cautiously distinguish the actual time of consolation from the period that follows it. At such a time, the soul is fervent and favored with the grace and the after effects of the consolation which has passed. In this second period, the soul frequently forms various resolutions and plans which are not granted directly from God our Lord. They may come from our own reasoning on the relations of our concepts and on the consequences of our judgments, or they may come from the good or evil spirit. Hence, they must be carefully examined, discerned, before they are given full approval and put into execution. Go back to my example. Okay, I feel, maybe I've had an extraordinary experience. God, the love of God is so overpowering, I know it is God's will that I study philosophy. I know it is God's will that I be a major in philosophy. And then I go on and I start planning, well, what courses I'm going to take, what am I going to do in the summer? Now, Ignatius is going to say, be careful. That powerful experience of God is underwriting your decision to enter, to become a philosophy major. But everything afterwards, you've got to continue to discern because it's not necessarily coming from God. All right, it could come from the good spirit or evil spirit, see? All right, so let us, so we'll conclude here with Ignatius. And so what can we say in, summarize? Okay, remember, objectively, I want to follow Jesus Christ. Okay, I'm making a retreat. I want to live and I want to choose a way of life and I want to choose in my life what will help me in my relationship to Jesus? Objective. Subjective, how am I feeling about this? How is God helping me with this? if I feel consoled, this is a good indication that what I'm deciding to do is of God's will. If I'm not feeling consolation, no. But then it gets complicated because a consolation, unless it comes directly from God, could also be coming from the evil spirit. So we got to continue to discern. Okay? So that in a nutshell is what Ignatius is talking about, discernment of spirits. Knowing, okay, following the right path, all right, living well, and knowing that I'm living well by God's grace, but always needs discernment. Okay, let's now look at the Tao Te Ching. Now, we're going to look at about 5 key verses, all right, and I think it can help you see some of the parallels here. They're not exact, of course, but they're very interesting parallels. So, verse 43 has it, 42 rather. The Tao produces the one. The Tao produces the one produces the two produce the three produce the 10,000 things, the world, everything, universe, all right? The 10,000 things carry yin and embrace yang, yin and embrace yang, all right? And blending their ki, their energy, they attain harmony. Many of you have probably heard this before, but this is extremely important. Now, this is an objective analysis of reality. Reality all comes from the Tao. The Tao is the origin. And out of the origin comes multiplicity. In another verse, the Tao is nothing. But that doesn't mean nothing literally. It means the Tao is not anything, like we understand things, okay? So the Tao produces the one produces the two. So everything comes from the Tao, and the 10,000 things carry in yin and embrace yang, and by their blending, their ki, they attain harmony. So for the Tao, harmony of nature is a complexus. Nature is complex. It's a complex of different, the yin and yang. What's another term for yin and yang? Complementaries. So reality is a complementary of opposites. Reality is complicated but ultimately integral. And this integrity is this integrity of a component of yin and yang that produces harmony. So the nature, all of reality, is a harmonious whole that embraces multiplicity, that embraces diversity. And this is going to be very, very important now as we move on, all right? But is that clear? Notice, it's objective, all right? This is not a projection of the sage. No, this is what reality is. The sage recognizes it. Let's go on. Now, second, talks about the activity of the Tao. So remember, the Tao in one verse, Tao is nothing, no thing. The second, the Tao does not act, wu wei, yet nothing is left undone. The Tao, whoops, oh shoot. Okay, wrong one. Okay, the Tao does not act. This is a negative, does not act, but nothing is left undone. Now, what is this? Again, this is a negative way of stating a truth. The Tao is active, supremely active in all of reality, but not active the way we are active. The Tao, for instance, does not act out of desire. The Tao does not act out of a desire to control. The Tao acts, but not the way we act. So Wu Wei means not action. It means literally, in another way of putting it, to act naturally. Okay? Yet nothing is left undone. So the Tao is creative without acting the way we act. Those familiar in philosophy of negative theology, this is the Eastern equivalent of negative theology. Now, okay, so that's the objective. Now, what about our response? In verse 41 has it, when the best student hears about the Tao, he practices it assiduously. When the average student hears about the Tao, it seems to him one moment there and gone the next. He goes back and forth. When the worst student hears about the Tao, he laughs out loud. If he did not laugh, it would be unworthy of being the Tao. So notice, interesting enough, just as Jesus Christ, not everybody is attracted to Jesus. In fact, very few are. Jesus himself has said, unless the Father draw one, no one will come to me. Most reject him, as today most reject him. Now, similarly, the Tao is the objective reality. Most people reject it. They laugh it off. You can't see the Tao. The Tao is eminently real, but it can't be controlled. It can't be seen, and so many people reject it. So notice, so our response is varied. Now, we go on. The most submissive thing in the world can overcome the hardest thing, that which is out without substance, entering into that which has no crevices. This is about the Tao. The Tao acts but is most submissive, most peaceful. The Tao is nothing. Nothing. And so the Tao is able to enter into everything peacefully. Does that remind you of something? Right? Okay. Consolation without previous cause for Ignatius, God. Okay. Notice, so, and the most submissive, the Tao is not violent. There's no violence, and yet the Tao is supremely powerful in weakness. It gets into things with no crevices. Now, here's the sage. That is why I, the sage, know the benefit of resorting to no action. Notice what the sage does. I want to follow the Tao. I'm attracted. I feel attracted to no thing, no action, and yet supremely effective. I'm attracted to that, all right? That is why I know the benefit of resorting to no action. Now again, it doesn't mean quietism. It doesn't mean sitting on my hands and doing nothing, but rather it means that whatever I do in accordance with the Tao. If I lecture in accordance with the Tao. Without violence, without fear, just naturally. And when I act naturally, I'm most effective. The teaching that uses no words, the most effective way of communicating, we usually think it's eloquent speech. Not necessarily. Sometimes no speech can be the most effective. St. Francis used to say, preach the gospel always, if necessary, with words. Okay, so the most powerful way of communicating is through silence. No words. The benefit of resorting to no action. These are beyond the understanding of all but a very few in the world. Now, we get to the subjective experience of the sage in following the Tao. So remember with consolation and desolation, all right, in Ignatius, so we see the parallel with the Tao. First, remember harmony, objective harmony of nature, all right, is this perfect coordination of opposites, the yin, the yang of all of nature. This is what the sage experiences within himself. Remember our complications? We're complicated beings interiorly. Well, the sage experiences all the complication, but in harmony. In harmony. There's a harmony there, okay? Again, mirroring the Tao. Think of following Jesus for Ignatius. Inner unity. Now, again, this unity doesn't mean a monolithic. No, this unity is always in complexity, but a complexity that is harmonious. I feel united. Think of integrity. A person with integrity can be very complicated, but it all fits together. Simplicity. This is a symbol for the piece of wood. For the Tao, the piece of uncarved wood is a favorite symbol for simplicity. The carver takes up the wood and carves it in any way he or she wants. But just to appreciate the uncarved piece of wood as it is, its simplicity, it's a beautiful. It has a beauty, a natural beauty that we miss. We want to rework it into something. Just stay with it. All right? And so too, the simplicity of the sage, the experience within. Okay? Jing, peace and stillness. Peace and stillness is the subjective experience of someone following the Tao. Think of consolation. On, contentment. Interesting symbol. Here's a symbol of a roof and the symbol of a woman. So when your wife is at home, you feel content. You're not afraid. All right, that's obviously from a male perspective. But so here we have, all right, again, on, contentment. And what is contentment? Ru, another, in inner tenderness and suppleness. The Tao uses water as a favorite image for the soul of the sage. Water is utterly supple. It's clear, supple. It can get into any crevice, and yet it is supremely powerful. It's so weak, and yet at the same time powerful. So the sage, they're inside the sage's fluid. He's supple, he's tender. The opposite, of course, is rigid, and we'll get to that. Bu Zheng, freedom from contention. Freedom from inner conflict. And when a person is free from inner conflict, he or she doesn't cause conflict with others, right? We know this is a psychological fact. People who can be destructive in community, where does it begin? They're struggling with something inside. They're contended, they're conflicted, okay? Dan, tranquility, another symbol of water and two symbols of fire. So water is able to, notice the dynamic symbolism here. Tranquility doesn't mean a monolithic stone, but rather complexity, but an inner integrity. Zhu, knowing contentment. This is the symbol for knowledge. This is a symbol for being enough. When I know I'm enough, I know content. But whenever I think I'm not enough, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, and then I'll be okay, what does that feel like? not content. I'm anxious. Okay. Now, subjective experience of those who do not follow the Tao. The sage follows the Tao and he experiences this inner harmony, this peace, tranquility, silence. The subjective experience of those who do not follow the Tao, feeling troubled. Now, I'm taking this from many different verses, so I'm just, this is a kind of a synthesis of the expression, the description of those who do not follow the Tao found in all these different verses. Huo, inner confusion. This is the Chinese for doubt. And this is a Chinese version for heart. When I'm in doubt, I feel confusion. When I'm not following the Tao, when I'm not following the objective goodness and harmony of nature, I feel disharmony. I feel stress, tension, restlessness. The discontent, not feeling content, that comes from the desire to possess. When I want to possess a thing, or even more subtly, another person. In my relationship, I want to dominate you. All right? That's an experience of discontent. Not to mention hurting the other. Again, a discontent that comes from what is difficult to obtain. I'm in stress because of something not here. I'm not being present. I'm thinking what I should do or what I could become. And then when I think of that here and now, I'm feeling disharmony. Now, so we've seen objectively what the Tao is. I think I like to say harmony in nature, the order of all of nature, harmonious. We've looked at the subjective experience of following the Tao, inner harmony, and the subjective experience of not following the Tao, inner disharmony, discontent. Now, remember with Ignatius, I can feel spiritual consolation, but that could be ambiguous. Well, what about the Tao? The sage's need for objective criterion of outer harmony of nature and human society, as well as subjective experience when choosing how to act. Okay, let me give you an example here. This is and I've talked with Professor Wang about this many, many times. One of the issues in Eastern philosophy is this experience of stillness, emptying the mind, and finding stillness within. All right, now that appears to be the effect of the Tao. But does it mean necessarily that if I have this experience in acting, that the acting is really in accord with the Tao? You understand the distinction? Okay, let me go. There's an objective and a subjective dimension. So just as in the spiritual exercises, the objective dimension is following Jesus, the subjective dimension is consolation. But remember, consolation can become ambiguous. It's got to be discerned. So too in the Tao, the question is, if I experience this inner peace in my activity, does that itself mean my activity is according to the Tao? Now, for many, this is the case. There's a tradition in Japan. Many warriors, before they went off to slaughter people, what did they do? Son Buddhism, which Zen Buddhism is a descendant of Taoism. They empty their mind, no thought. And so they go forth with no thought. They're very effective in what they do, but does that make it according to the Tao? Does that make it right? It's a question. The kamikaze pilots, before they went to, to their death and the death of others, either they got drunk or those who are more sophisticated went into meditation. Still the mind, no thoughts. Today, transcendental meditation is very popular, right? You probably know. Many business executives, many politicians, they work night and day for domination of others, whether economically or politically. It's a dog-eat-dog world. It's an ambitious world, and they get stressed. How do I relieve stress? Each morning for an hour. Om. I still my mind so that I can go forth into the political world of cutthroat or the economic world. Does that make it right? See? So this is an issue here. This is a very, very important issue. Now, I believe there is enough evidence in the Tao Te Ching to indicate that Lao Tzu, or those authors who are behind the Tao Te Ching, they're aware of this. They're aware that it is ambiguous. Inner silence, peace, is important. Without it, you're not following the Tao. But is it sufficient? It's a necessary condition, but is it sufficient? And I would argue, for Lao Tzu, it is insufficient. It's necessary, but it's insufficient. What needs to do is my activity, if I'm at peace, without thought, inner stillness, that activity must contribute, be in harmony with nature, be in harmony with the environment. If it's not, my peace doesn't mean I'm following the Tao. All right, I have two examples here. In verse 31, the verse has it, military arms are instruments of ill omen and not the instruments of a gentleman. So the Tao is, remember, the Tao is peaceful. It's natural. Violence is against nature. We see this in Aristotle, Book 5 of the Metaphysics, he said. What is violent is unnatural. This is the Tao. All right, the Tao is not violent, it is natural. So the sage is against forms of violence, unnaturality. Okay? But notice, when one is compelled to use them, it is best to do without relish. When one is compelled to use them, sometimes the use of force is necessary. Sometimes. There is no glory in victory, and to glorify it despite this is to exult in the killing of men. There's another passage, verse 36, talks about when we celebrate a military victory to protect our nation, the celebration should be like a funeral because people are being killed. We did the right thing, but we don't rejoice. We're sad. Notice, again, sometimes we have to make decisions, all right, that seem to be we have to use force. Another one, in verse 74, the regular executioner whose charge it is to kill. There is a regular executioner whose charge it is to kill. To kill on behalf of the executioner is what is described as chopping wood on behalf of the master carpenter. In chopping wood on behalf of the master carpenter, there are few who escape hurting their own hands instead. Right, now, what could this mean? Scholars have interpreted this in a number of ways. Here's one way. There is a form of execution that is legitimate, but only the right person is able to do that. For instance, in just law tradition, right? Capital punishment in some situations for the defense of others is all right, but not everybody can do it, right? It's only the properly elected representative of the community who can do it. Possibly. That's a possible interpretation. Another is, there is a regular executioner whose charge it is to kill. That is Tao, God. To kill on behalf of the executioner is what is described as chopping wood on behalf of the master carpenter, and you get hurt. Another interpretation is only God can kill. We cannot. And any time we do kill, we try to justify it, it's very hard to escape hurting ourselves as well. Okay, these are, again, different interpretations. What I'm trying to present you with is that the person who follows the Tao, all right, acts peacefully, acts in harmony within himself or herself and in nature, and that the experience, the inner experience of harmony, is a sine qua non. It's a necessary condition for following the Tao, but it is not a sufficient condition. So too, and this is where further discernment. So too with the spiritual exercise. So here is where we kind of join hands, all right? So as in the spiritual exercises, I can experience spiritual consolation when I think I'm doing God's will. Sometimes not. Sometimes that experience of spiritual consolation actually is moving me not to do God's will. So this is where, again, discernment of spirit. So for Ignatius, what do? We look at Jesus Christ as understood by the faith community of the church. If my action is in harmony with Jesus and I feel consolation, that is a necessary and sufficient condition. But, again, necessary condition. Let's go back to the Tao. The Tao, too. There's an objective and subjective dimension. The objective dimension is my action is in conformity with the harmony of nature. And I'm contributing to the harmony of nature. The subjective experience is inner harmony. When I have both those conditions, subjective and objective, I can be sure I am following the Tao. I can be sure that I am living well and I'm knowing what I'm doing. I know that I'm living well. The happiness that Aristotle talks about. Living well and knowing you're doing well and enjoying it. Thank you.
Minutes of questions?
Yes,
All right, okay.
definitely.
So now we open the floor. Yes.
A couple of questions based on personal examples. What happens when one's ability to make decisions goes away? My dad was in university in his junior year. The Depression came. My grandfather was an entertainer. Vaudeville disappeared in a few weeks. His responsibility was to the family. He took a job in an accounting department, never finished university, and became the breadwinner. I'm currently struggling in a scenario where I've become a caregiver, where the bulk of my life now, where the decisions and the places that I wanted to go and the things I wanted to do, I've been eradicated by my requirements to look after my better half. Fortunately, she is my best friend, and I've not declined to do so. What happens in your scenario where this ability to decide goes away?
Well, first of all, it doesn't go away. You always have a choice. You don't have to care for your wife, but you do. All right, now.
You know my wife.
All right. But this is, freedom of choice is not an all or none. It's always contextual, all right? There are plenty of things in our lives that we have no choice over, all right? And yet, how we respond is our choice. Now, Ignatius would say, he might invite you First of all, I think he'd probably say you've made the right choice, but he might invite you, how about making a retreat? Look at Jesus and let Jesus be the model for you in your decision to care for your wife. Lao Tzu might say, look at the Tao. Remember, the Tao is not simply inner harmony, but the promotion of outer harmony. You're helping the weak, the sick, the poor, is contributing to the harmony of nature. You are living the Tao. Now try to live it with peace. See? Right? Because following the Tao, you're going to have inner peace and you are contributing to harmony. Right? Now if you're not having inner peace, that's where you need to look at, okay, now how can I find that inner peace? I know I'm doing what is right. All right? Now how can I feel that? How can I even enjoy that?
Thanks, Tommy. Really good. I have a couple of things I'll ask you afterwards, but the first one I wanted to ask is, both of these seem to lean really heavily on the correct apprehension of the objective reality,
Yes.
which, not to say we've skipped over it, but this is sort of just assuming that we can really ascertain what sort of life Jesus would endorse, or what sort of life is in harmony with nature. Which seems to me to be really difficult in both cases, and probably even more difficult in the case of Taoism, because at least you've got stories that are more concrete in the case of the gospel. So what about that? I mean, doesn't this presuppose a pretty sophisticated grasp already of objective reality?
I think it does. But I would say ancient Chinese philosophy is much like ancient Greek philosophy, Plato and Aristotle. To be able to understand reality, I first need conversion. I need a moral conversion. I need to be converted to love the good. Without that, I cannot see what is real. Right? So a moral conversion. Lao Tzu talks about this, that this is why many people laugh at the Tao. They aren't converted to realize, wow, this is right. Now,
But even more, so there's the people who are going to laugh at the Tao or laugh at the folly of the cross, right? But even amongst those who don't, there's going to be sometimes very significant.
yes,
What is it?
that's right. That's right. And you're absolutely right. And this is why the need for constant conversion. Constant meditation on who Jesus is. We think we know who Jesus is until we start struggling in real concrete ways, and then I've got to go back and, the same thing with the Tao. I think it's an ongoing conversion. Nobody is just converted. We've got to continually be converted to the truth. Yes. Okay, so we should have a lady next to a lady.
Okay, thank you. I have a question regarding comparing the two, Lao Tzu and Ignatius, but but my first question regards discerning spirits and trying to discern whether you're moving towards consolation or desolation. And my question is, how do you integrate with that whole project the idea of the law of the cross, that we are, as followers of Christ, we're expected to pick up our cross and follow him and embrace the kind of suffering that would involve, so that my life, I should expect it not to all be consoling and, hearts and flowers, and
That's right.
but to involve quite a bit of suffering, and to embrace that suffering. And so how do you discern the normal suffering that goes along with choosing to take a particular path. How is that related to what could appear to be desolation?
That's right. No, that's a very, very good question. Again, let me reemphasize the importance of when you come to a retreat, it's your concrete experience that you're bringing to bear. And some people are asked to carry very heavy crosses, and so the discernment of who Jesus is for that reason much more profound than some of us others. I think you embrace the cross. Again, this is a matter of discernment now. Is God asking me? Say, for instance, my wife is a paraplegic, suddenly. I mean, this is not something you choose.
Right.
God, no. I mean, no one chooses suffering. You'd have to be crazy, all right? And Jesus didn't even. He chose to love, and it meant suffering. But no one chooses to suffer as such. But if I'm in a situation that's going to involve suffering, what is my response? And again, this is where, for Ignatius, you have to look at Jesus, how he took up his cross for our sake, And so let him guide you, because maybe God is asking you to be Jesus in your situation. And that could be different from, each one of us is unique, all right? So but it would be consoling in this, that it would be out of the love of God. See, remember that consolation would be love of God. It doesn't mean I could be struggling on all different levels, but deep down, because of Jesus, I accept it. I accept it, and I even feel consoled. Now, interesting enough, just from a philosophical perspective, for those of you who know, in Aristotle, Book 9, he talks about the courageous person who would be willing to give up his very life for his country and all the pain that would involve for the sake of doing what is to kalon, noble. But that takes a person who's so converted to the good that even though it's painful, in any other situation he would never, because life is most precious to the good person. But for the sake of to kalon, for my community, I embrace it. Right, that would be as close, philosophically, as one could come to what Jesus did. And I think the Tao, arguably, the Tao, like water, can descend to the lowest places where no other creature would go because it's too shameful. The Tao goes. And so letting the Tao be my guide in these terrible situations means I am the servant of the servant. I am willing to give up everything to help this poor creature to be without pain, or whatever.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Well, thank you for sharing with us today. My question is, when you're trying to follow God's will, and someone trying to follow God's will, should they always be questioning, or will there ever be, as Ignatius talks about this time of consolement, will that ever manifest itself in rest or contentment with where you are in God's will, or should you always be questioning and always be searching?
Well, for Ignatius, again, if I'm looking at Jesus conscientiously. I'm praying to God, help me to be, put Jesus at the center of my life. Help him to be my inspiration. And then Ignatius says you should expect to feel consolation. Yeah, in general, you should expect. Remember, consolation, like for in the Tao, consolation is a necessary but insufficient condition. It's necessary, though. If you really love God and you're not feeling good about following Jesus, hey, there's something wrong there, right? Okay? But, again, to feel good, that's a necessary but but an insufficient condition. But no, Ignatius would expect, in general. Now, we're going to be challenged by new things, you know. I might feel for a while, hey, you know, things are going pretty well. Oh yeah, I suffer, you know, and then suddenly something hits, like a loved one dies, or, you know, I get in a car accident, and whoa, that's a new challenge. You know, so again, it's a challenge. I've got to get back to Jesus. I'm struggling here. This is beyond my strength. So I got to look on Jesus, ask for strength. But Ignatius thinks strength will come. But it's always going to be, in that sense, there's always going to be a challenge to death. Death is the final challenge for all of us.
Josh, you want to go ahead, Josh?
Sure, I have a question. That is interesting. So my concern is about rationalization, and the idea that, oh, we're feeling good about life, sometimes we're deluding ourselves. And so I like that you suggest, you know, maturity and constant discernment. I don't know if there's a better recipe. It seemed like there was a difference in where we find the sort of hint that something is amiss still. It seemed like there, in the Ignatian tradition, you look within, there's still some sort of desolation or a hint of a little bit of leftover lingering desolation, even though we got that first good dose of consolation.
That's right.
But that's an inward sort of turn. I still have this feeling. It sounded like with the Taoism, you might be feeling an inner harmony, but if you extend your vision, you might see, oh, the situation, the cosmos around us, there's still disharmony. I'm wondering about this inner, outer. Is there a difference in where we find that lingering disturbance?
Well, let me start with Ignatius. I mean, I can't answer you fully because, first of all, I have a truncated presentation here. Ignatius goes into why we can have desolation, but we didn't, for lack of time, we couldn't get into that. But what he would say would be this: at times we can feel desolate, again, even when we're following Jesus, but that is not caused by God. It's a result either of our lack of prayer. You know, we got to keep praying, you know, and sometimes we feel we can coast, and then something hits us, and we can fall into a kind of desolation, which is the result of pride, lack of humility. I'm not praying anymore, see? So desolation can be caused by the evil spirit. It can also be a result of our lack of fidelity. So it's, you know, and God will allow desolation. He doesn't cause it. God never causes desolation. God causes joy and peace because that's who God is. But we fall into it, and for a number of reasons, and that's part of the prayer. Ignatius says, go back to prayer. Why am I feeling desolate? You know, okay, maybe I'm being tempted. Maybe God is allowing this to strengthen me, or maybe I just haven't been really praying every day. You know, I mean, maybe I've just let it slide. And now I'm falling into a kind of ennui. When I think about God, I don't feel anything. Or I can feel dark, see? So the ideology of this can be complex, and this is why prayer, or Ignatius always talks about spiritual direction, the importance of going to someone who has experience that you can trust, share with him your experience, and listen to his response. Now, you still have to discern and pray about it, but, you know, getting help from others is important. Yes. Oh. Yes. Yes.
Thank you for your talk and the comparisons you made about exactly what he was asking about, what Josh asked about, were very clear. I wonder about I want to compare the way. I am the way. Mm-hmm. And the discernment of that is one's path.
Yes.
It's a path. Mm-hmm. The way is, whatever it is, it's not a linear path.
Okay, that's right.
It's multiplicity.
Yes, I mean, it's open to all of us have to find the way, but it'll be a different way. By the way, you can see, by the way as a reality is practical. You got to live the way to know the way. Just as with Jesus, you've got to follow Jesus by living to know Jesus. You can't step back, go on a theology course, and learn a lot about from books and say, I know who Jesus is. Doesn't work that way. So you've got to commit yourself. If you want to know the way, you've got to live the way. If you want to know Jesus Christ, you've got to try to live. Now, having said that, notice Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And there's been a very famous translation of the Bible, John 1. In the beginning was the way, it was the Tao. In the beginning, of course, was the Word, but a famous Chinese translation is, in the beginning was the Tao. And the Tao was with God, and the Tao was God. And everything that is comes from the Tao. Verse 42. So there are some very, very interesting parallels.
There's a lady that blew, yeah.
Raise my hand 10 times.
Yes, okay, yes, yes.
Stand up.
Yes, yes. Loyola.
I'm just joking. With regards to discernment of God's will, St. Paul talks about God's good, pleasing, and perfect will. And it seems to me that it's an exercise in frustration, because God is so mysterious, to say, God, show me your perfect will. Come on, God, I just want to do the perfect thing. I know about the good and the pleasing, but, show me the perfect thing. I don't know where you stand on that, but I think this whole business of searching for God's will, in such, as if there's only one way to do it, I find that very frustrating.
Right. Okay. Ignatius would respond by saying, if you want to know God's will, look at Jesus. This is who Jesus is, all right? Loving, serving others, suffering, dying, and rising by God's power. This is what we're all called to. That's God's will for each one of us, to live as Jesus. But each one of us has to live as Jesus in our own situation. God asks different things of each one of us. We have different crosses. See, and so this is where a retreat for Ignatius. He would urge you, if you had some time, go on a retreat. Take some time to be with Jesus. Bring your life to bear on your contemplation of Jesus, and be open. How is God inviting? What is God inviting me to do? What choice might be with,
I think on small things, that's fair. But I think if you have big decisions that you're really struggling with, or big things that have happened that you're trying to accept, I think it becomes more of a challenge.
Absolutely.
And if you can just feel good about something, you don't have to feel perfect. If you can just feel good, 51% instead of 100, then it seems to me that should be enough. That you shouldn't be searching for, because God is so mysterious. I just don't think you should be searching for this perfect will that's going to be, perfection. It's not going to happen in this lifetime. No matter how many retreats I go on, I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, I think maybe the better question is not to search for perfection. Maybe that's getting you mixed up. Rather, just search for getting to know who Jesus is. And I just like to live like Jesus, as far as I can, as far as God helps me. Okay, I'm going to fall, I'm going to fail. Okay, well, that's human. But I just keep my eyes on Jesus. And out of love for him, I do that. That would be...
Let me just tell you where I'm coming from. My daughter was killed, and people came up to me, not all people, but, oh, it's God's will. She was just too good to be in this life, God's will that somebody kill somebody? I don't think so. And so I struggled for a long time with what kind of God lets this happen? Is this your will, God, for Julie? Wasn't Julie supposed to be a teacher? That's what she wanted to be. but yet she's not. So what's your will, dear God?
And it's it's a powerful one. I mean, all I can say is, we talk about the mystery of evil in philosophy. We're all familiar with that. But ultimately, the only answer God gives is His Son, dying on the cross and yet rising.
Scott has a question.
So I actually wanted to piggyback on something Brian brought up, this idea about sort of how do we have this correct perception, right? So you're contemplating like Christ, right? And you mentioned a few times this idea that Ignatius will say, well, a good spirit will sort of lead you into a sort of proper orientation into the life of Christ. But I think, Brian, I want to sort of press Brian's question a little bit. I wonder, does Ignatius talk anywhere about the role of the magisterium in helping you to assist you in sort of perceiving and interpreting the life of Christ correctly and implementing it in your own life in a sort of upright way? Because obviously, if you have sort of robust understanding of Christology, you say, well, Christ had members, right? And so I'm wondering if there's some role of the magisterium in assisting you to perceive things properly when you're trying to make these very important, very practical decisions. That's one. And then the second one, you can just the idea, is this compatible, do you think, or how would you relate the exercise with Aristotle's stuff on prudence? Aristotle's discussion of prudence.
Prudence.
Because I've heard some people suggest that they're really opposed. And I don't know enough about the exercises to be able to speak on that, but I really like, especially you of all people, I really like to hear what you thought about that. Is there some kind of tension between the virtue of prudence on the one hand and with the exercise on the other?
Okay, let's see. Those two you asked. Okay, the first one was the magisterium. For Ignatius, in the spiritual exercises, who Jesus is found in the Gospels as understood by the faith community of the church. Basic. I can't know who Jesus is outside the church, for Ignatius. Can't do it. Okay, that's one. Also, if you look, and I can show you later some of the places in the spiritual exercise, the parameter of our choices we make is circumscribed by the faith community. So if I want to discern, for instance, I'm getting tired of my wife, and I wanted to discern to divorce her and marry somebody else, for Ignatius, that's not a choice to discern about. It's not God's will, period. Now that's hard, for a contemporary view, because we think, well, that's okay, but not in God. Jesus was quite strong on, for instance, divorce. So it's always Jesus as understood by the faith community. All right, so that's first. Now, second, prudence. Well, I think for Aristotle, prudence presupposes, I would argue, Sophia. Without Sophia, you can't be prudent. So remember, prudence is that ability, that practical ability to see what is right in the given situation. Now, that means that takes moral habituation. Granted, it takes a good community, but ultimately it takes a kind of wisdom to know what is, NE 1 and 10, what is the good life? If I don't have the wisdom, and that's Sophia, that's not, what's the Greek for? Phronesis. That's not phronesis. Phronesis doesn't tell me what happiness is. That's Sophia. Without an understanding, a robust understanding, a sophic, a wise understanding of what is the good life, I cannot be prudent here and now. Now, obviously for Aristotle, a lot of people don't have that, but what you do is you rely on a community then, where at least some people in the community have that wisdom, and that I move toward it. All right, that's, in a nutshell, how, I think that's the right interpretation of Aristotle. It's not the popular one because people would like to separate prudence from Sophia and say, you don't need Sophia. You know, some argue even that we can do away with book 10. We don't need it. That's not Aristotle. You know, it may be a modernist interpretation of Aristotle, I grant that, but it's not Aristotle. Now, how would that compare with Ignatius? Discernment, well, Ignatius, of course, his understanding, it would be similar, it would be analogical, because it would be similar, but of course much richer, because for Ignatius, true happiness is not simply in this life, but eternal life with God, see? And so that would make a kind of Christian prudence much richer than an Aristotelian prudence. But they're in the same, I mean, they're, you know, I think there's an analogy can be drawn.
Can we take last question for this
Yes.
young lady and then, yeah, yeah.
I like to talk, and I was wondering, especially on the rules of discernment, who uses like this practice? Like I was wondering, like is it taught for like the clergy to use this? Like does the newly elected pope when he goes in and prays, is this the process he uses? And like also Vatican officials, is this how they make their like official decisions on anything? I think that would be interesting, especially on kind of more controversial topics, like what is their thought process?
Right, right. For Ignatius, the rules for the discernment of spirits are in the appendix of the spiritual exercises. So anyone who does a retreat is encouraged to look at those rules. And hopefully with someone who has some experience to bring them to bear on that person's life. See? It's always concrete on some decision. All right, and then the rules with proper guidance will make perfect sense. But other than that, they're open to, you know, I mean, you can find the rules. I mean, you can get a copy of the spiritual exercises for one.
Is it like a common practice of clergy to use this with like important decisions?
I can't say. I hope it is, but I don't.
Well, it is for Jesuits.
It is for Jesuits. But
And our Pope is a Jesuit.
and our Pope is a Jesuit, yes. So I hope he's using it. Yes. Eric. Oh, okay.
For another question?
Sure, go ahead.
I wanted to ask about the comparison you've chosen to make between the spiritual exercises and Taoism. Because it seems to me that you could find very parallel spiritual guidance, spiritual advice in all sorts of different traditions. You mentioned non-Christian Greek traditions. We could have looked at Sufism, Hindu traditions, Buddhism. I'd be surprised if you couldn't find something like it in Native American spirituality. Isn't this really a kind of perennialism? Or is there some specificity to the parallel?
No, I think that's an excellent question. First of all, I was asked, you know, Robin asked about Christianity and Taoism, so, but, no, but yes, I think there is a perennial. I would make a distinction here, and I mean, stepping out on thin ice here, but a religious point of view, which I would include Taoism and St. Ignatius, and the perennial philosophy, is a more of a classical understanding of reality, not a modernist or postmodernist. And by that I mean a modernist is, as I understand modernism, or I want to understand it, or postmodernism, there is no ultimate truth. We decide, or the individual decides. You make it work for yourself. That's truth. That is not Christian. It's not Jewish. It's not perennial. It's not the early Tao Te Ching. So I would draw, yes, a perennial philosophy would be the classical view. There is truth, goodness, beauty in the world. Now, it's difficult. I think Brian is absolutely right, and Plato would say that. It's very difficult. That doesn't, to discern that doesn't mean it isn't there. It means we need to help each other convert so that we can begin. And it's a process. I mean, we have to continually, we need a continual conversion to know what the truth is and to live it. Continual.
Well, before thank you, Father Sherman, I also want to thank you, Emma, for in ACTI and Alexis in philosophy department getting all the food. All right, and thank you very much.
Thank you.